a frontier, a home of rich history and freezing hardships. One single place filled with beauty and grave danger. Alaska, the last frontier, and one of the last homes of ancient and rich native history that is slowly dying out and being forgotten. Although there are some who hope to keep these traditions and stories alive, some, such as Sidney Huntington, half native, half white. Sidney Huntington went through many different events, both traumatic and heartwarming. But in this short movie that is acting like one of those documentaries that you would see from like National Geographic or something, or those doing really bad at it, we will detail the occasion that happened a short time after his mother died and was consumed by maggots. That occasion being his trip and visit to the town of Anvik, where he would be taken care of by the bishops of the Anvik mission, which taught him discipline and lesson. This is the bad introduction to the story of Sidney Huntington and his trip to Anvik. The story begins with Sidney Huntington at the age of 5 and his two other siblings, Jimmy, age 3, and Marion, age 1.5, were at their cabin with their mother on Hog River. When they were fishing, they caught a fish called a whitefish. Their mother ate its gut and died shortly after. The event left Sidney Huntington and his siblings alone to survive. They ended up surviving, and they were found by their dad, but without their mother. This is an important point in the story that led Sidney Huntington and his little brother, Jimmy, to go to the Episcopal mission, or Anvik mission, that was happening at the town of Anvik. Since their dad had no one to care for them, and he could not care for them himself, he sent them to the mission at Anvik, and this would help Sidney Huntington and his brother with a few problems they had at the time.
Anvik was a rather small mission, as many others at the time. Like many of the other villages, a mission was going on, or to be more specific, religious missions were happening to the villages at the time.
These missions were acts made by either Catholic or Orthodox Christians to Alaska and to help the natives in their villages with a variety of different tasks. The missions did a few specific things to help the natives, the two most prominent being to provide the natives with hospitals and schools. But the mission also did other things, such as provide food for the needy and take care of the children who women and sometimes men could not support alone. Each of the missions got the support from people who were willing to supply the food, clothes, and money, and most of the support came from the lower 48, and people from outside the US. While the main goal of the missions was to help the natives, they also had a secondary purpose, which was to integrate more people into their religion. But it was not to take advantage of them. It was to teach them the moral lessons that their religion taught.
The Anvik mission happened a short ways away from Anvik itself, and at Anvik mission there were 3 key buildings. The first key building was the church itself. Its specific dimensions were roughly 28 by 40 feet long, and it was made from logs and timber.
The 2 other buildings are the boys' and girls' dormitories, with the latter being 36 feet by 80 feet, and the former being somewhat smaller, and its dimensions mostly unknown. Sidney Huntington was impressed by the size of the mission, but he suffered from one major problem. The problem was that he did not trust other people, especially adults. He got this distrust because when he was alone, he felt like his father had abandoned them. the mission would only end up halfway quenching his mistrust of other people, and it really did not end up helping his distrust of his father. While Sidney Huntington did not trust many people, there was a few who were an exception, mainly Reverend John Bentley, one of the people who ran the mission. Sidney trusted, or at least somewhat trusted, another person named Bishop Rowe, who was very respected and trusted and loved by the native community. Bishop Rowe was someone who seemed like he was very much full of himself. He often told stories of things he had done, such as scaring off the blue parka bandit. Sometime after Sidney and Jimmy came to the mission, two brothers came to Anvik, and they had a somewhat similar life experience to Sidney and Jimmy, what it was like having no father and a dead mother. Sidney became best friends with one of the brothers, and the brother stayed near Sidney at almost all times. Eventually the boy became sick, and he died a few days later. For Sidney, this was a really big turning point in his life at Anvik. On the outer regions of Anvik, and nothing but a small little hut built for him by the bishops of the mission, Blind Andrew lived there. As you can tell by his name, he was a blind man. Occasionally, Sidney would visit Blind Andrew to help him chop wood, but Andrew could do some of the work by himself. Another man named Old Harry, or Saccharoni as he was called by the mission, was another person that Sidney helped out, but even him more so than Blind Andrew. Macaroni had once given Sidney the task of digging up some salmon he had buried a year earlier. Sidney and Old Harry had gone to the river, where the salmon was buried, but as he got there, Old Harry had needed to slow down and catch his breath, so he sent Sidney up ahead to get the salmon and told him where it was located. The salmon was located next to a tree on the river marked with a stick. Salmon buried underground, covered in moss and other stuff, for a year was a native delicacy, although it smelled terrible because the salmon was rotten. Sidney unburied the salmon and brought it back to Macaroni, where he then proceeded to eat some salmon, although Sidney was reluctant.
Salmon are buried underground and covered in moss and other stuff for over a year. It was a native delicacy, although it smelled terrible because the salmon was rotten. It tasted good, I guess.
Sidney eventually went to his dormitory and the whole place smelled bad. To say the least, Sidney was not allowed to go on any more trips like that with Old Harry again. At Anvik, Sidney learned a great deal of many things, such as discipline and moral lessons. Sidney had also learned how to make some fish traps and other neat things. When Sidney's father came to see Sidney, he did not hug him because Sidney had trust issues still. So, Sidney's dad took him to help him with that. This concludes the story of Sidney Huntington's journey to Anvik and the mission. Overall, it was a big and important event in his life that changed him for the better, and may have been one of the most important events in his life because of how it taught him moral lessons and discipline. Without this event in his life, he may have not been the man he was widely known to be. Goodbye, and this was a terrible way to end this documentary that is not a documentary.